Long day? Everybody feeling good? Or a little tired? Good? Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro, Mary. It's so good to be back at LeadDev London. It's one of my absolute favorite places in the whole world. This conference has meant so much to me and to my career, the relationships I've made here. So it's always a privilege to get to come back and to tell a story, one of my favorite things to do. So today, I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to tell you a story, but instead of the story of some place we're not likely to ever experience, like the control room of a nuclear reactor or the cockpit of a commercial airliner, today, I want to tell you the story of the building that you're sitting in right now. When I walked onto this stage for the first time back in 2018 to tell the story of 3 Mile Island, I had no idea where I was. I knew that the Barbican Center was where the London Symphony played, but I had no idea I was walking in the footsteps of musical luminaries from Yo-Yo Ma to Herbie Hancock to Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop has played this stage. Once the pressure of my talk was over that first year, I took some time to walk around, to look around, to explore the grand stairways, the large open spaces, the sheer sense of place that the Barbican evokes. I eventually wandered out to the lakeside terrace and realized just how big this place is. I had a vague sense that the Barbican Center was a part of a larger complex, but I didn't know that the complex was a monument of mid-century brutalist architecture, built on an impossibly grand scale. And in a pattern that seems to occur over and over again in my life, I found myself wondering, how did this happen? How did this place get here? And I've been fascinated with the Barbican ever since. In a bit of bittersweet news, this is actually the last year LeadDev will be at the Barbican Center. There's more people who want to come than can fit in this room. It's a great problem to have. And I'll let Mary tell you more about where LeadDev is off to next year after my talk. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to dig into the story of the Barbican, to tell the story of this stage from this stage, and to help LeadDev bid the Barbican Center a fond farewell. To tell the story of the Barbican, we have to go back in history, way back, in fact, to ancient Roman London. Those black lines you see on the map up there are the walls of ancient Londinium. They served as the fortified boundary of the city with the River Thames on the southern border. Now, the boundaries of Roman London roughly align with the modern city of London, shown here in red within Greater London. And because there's almost certainly someone else in the room as confused as I was the first time I heard this, the City of London, or the City, is a local government district within Greater London. It's like a borough, but it's not a borough for some obscure technical reasons that I'm not going to talk about. If you look towards the northwest corner of ancient London, you'll notice there's a set of walls within the walls. This is Londinium's Barbican, the fortified gate into the city. When the city was under threat, the other gates would be locked, but necessary traffic could still come and go through the heavily guarded Barbican. This area, where the Barbican of London was, is where we are right now, in the Cripplegate ward of the City of London. Named for Cripplegate, here on the north side of the Barbican, named for the population of beggars who used to gather there right outside the church. In fact, some of the ancient Roman wall is still standing within the Barbican complex, seen here across from St. Giles Cripplegate Church. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Cripplegate area had become dominated by the rag trade, home to clothing factories and warehouses and the relatively impoverished workers who worked in them. If you came in today through the Silk Street entrance, now you know why it's called Silk Street. By the 1930s, this area was one of the highest insurance cost areas of London because the warehouse is full of highly flammable cloths. So when a formation of Luftwaffe bombers dropped incendiary firebombs here on December 29, 1940, as a part of the ongoing Blitz of London in World War II, the area went up like a tinderbox. The fire was so hot that even the brick burned in many places. In the background, behind the piles of rubble and the twisted steel, you can see the severely damaged but somehow still standing St. Giles Cripplegate Church. Sir Patrick Abercrombie was chosen by London authorities to lead the redevelopment efforts. Abercrombie was an architect and an academic, holding professorships of urban planning first at the University of Liverpool and then later at University College London. He was a well-known authority on civil planning at the time. And he developed 2 plans. First, the County of London Plan in 1943, and second, the Greater London Plan in 1944. Government planners saw the silver lining in the destruction from World War II as a chance to revisit and revise the largely happenstance development of London. That meant reconstruction was to be highly planned, highly controlled, and highly coordinated. Abercrombie's thesis was simple. Pre-war London was too dense, with people living on top of each other in squalid conditions, so he proposed decentralization. In order for everyone to have access to walkable neighborhoods with shopping and suitable public spaces, he proposed moving some of the population of London, displaced by the bombing, out to the suburban ring, the new towns as they were known. Crucially, Abercrombie's plan called for no housing whatsoever in the city of London. It was widely held here that the land in the city was too valuable to be used for housing, and that the professional class that worked in the city's office towers wouldn't want to live in a dense urban area anyway. 2 years later, though, and Abercrombie's decentralist ambitions were already falling apart. The planning burden meant that almost no new construction had been started. Squatting in abandoned properties was common because there was no other housing in central London available. Despite massive efforts to quickly construct suburban villages out of prefabricated housing units like this one, few people wanted to live in the suburbs because it took too long to get into London, especially with war damage to roads and railways. In the city of London itself, a grand total of 5 building permits had been issued in the decade following World War II, with 4 of them being repairs for existing structures and only 1 new building started, an office tower. You can see in this photo that very little has been done in Cripplegate Ward other than clearing the rubble. And the major reason for this is that a fight was brewing in the City of London Corporation. One faction was strongly in favor of Abercrombie's vision of only allowing commercial development in the city. They wanted the tax revenue. The other faction, led by Eric Wilkins, chair of the London City Corporation's Public Health Committee, was staunchly in favor of building housing. His faction won an important victory in 1950. The city was facing a huge shortfall of labor for essential workers in janitorial, food service, and police positions, among others. Wilkins had advocated for the city to buy land and fund development of a housing estate along Golden Lane, in blue here on the map, even though the majority of the land was in neighboring Finsbury Borough, to provide council housing for workers in the city in hopes of relieving the labor shortage. They got their way when the land purchase was approved by the city's full Court of Common Council. In order to get the project moving quickly, once the land was purchased, they decided to award the design contract for the Golden Lane estate by way of an architectural competition run by the Royal Institute of British Architects. Among the 187 entries they received, there was one each by each of these men, Joe Chamberlain, Geoffrey Powell, and Christoph Bonn. They were all teachers in the School of Architecture at the Kingston School of Art here in London. They were also very good friends, their families regularly going on holidays together. They would have been much younger, in their early 30s in 1951. The 3 of them made a pact that if any of them got lucky and won, they'd resign their teaching posts at Kingston and use the project to launch an architectural firm together. And on February 26, 1952, against incredibly long odds, that's exactly what happened. The clerk for the City Corporation called Geoffrey Powell to let him know that his design had won, beating out several British architecture heavyweights of the time. The clerk promptly asked if the 3 young architects were sure that they were up for doing such a big job. And goodness were they. The Golden Lane estate is widely regarded as one of the most important examples, not just of British post-war housing, but of mid-century architecture in general. You can see in this picture how they took advantage of the basements of the cleared, bombed-out buildings to give the estate vertical variation, allowing the gardens and ponds to be an urban oasis ensconced by the buildings around them. Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond considered the entire estate a single piece of architecture. The way the buildings relate to each other and to the public spaces between them were just as much architecture to the trio as the buildings themselves. The entirety of Golden Lane Estate, all of the buildings and all of the grounds, is Grade 2 listed, which means it's a building of historical significance, except for this building. This building is Grade 2 Star, Crescent House. Now, Grade 2 Star is a step above Grade 2, and it's the highest grade any building newer than the country I flew over from is probably going to get. Not bad for the first major project by a trio of 30-somethings. Now, while Golden Lane was being built, the conflict between powerful factions on the London City Corporation over what to do with the Cripplegate property continued. The majority opinion was still that building office space was the only responsible use for such valuable land. The fight came to a head in 1952 in a debate raised in the Court of Common Council, again by Eric Wilkins, the same person who had advocated for Golden Lane. And the point Wilkins made was simple. In 1851, the population of the City of London had been over 100,000 people. By 1951, after World War II, that population was down to 5,324, with just 28 living in Cripplegate Ward. Now, such a low population put the city at risk of losing its MP, or even worse, being absorbed by the larger London County Council and ceasing to exist altogether. Now, Wilkins' doom and gloom won some people over that day, but by February 1963, the council's investigations had resulted in a decision that building housing still was not economically viable. Office developers began circling the Cripplegate property like hawks, lobbying for planning approval for their office towers. But opposition remained. An independent group calling itself the New Barbican Committee formed to oppose the office tower scheme. Now, this was a group made up of a few people from London Council and several residents who lived in the city. They commissioned Sergei Cadley, a lecturer at the Royal College of Art, to create a design for a mixed-use development that would provide both space, office space, and housing. And this was the result, the New Barbican, a mix of shorter flat blocks and taller office towers, all set on a pedestal allowing for underground shopping and services. The design received lots of press coverage, and Cadley was even invited to present it to the House of Commons. A second plan for the Barbican area came from within the London City Corporation itself. They wanted more of a compromise on a smaller scale than the New Barbican plan. Leslie Martin, architect of the council, and H. Anthony Meelan, the city planning officer, produced a compromise plan in 1954 that featured mostly office towers with some flats and retail space surrounding St. Giles Church. But there were still plenty of council members in the city corporation firmly convicted that the Cripplegate site should be purely residential, that the city needed housing. And in late 1954, that small faction reached out to Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond to unofficially commission a plan. Now, I say unofficially because it was just a few members from the London City Corporation, not the corporation itself. And critically, they didn't pay Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond anything for this design. They just asked them to submit it. The firm knew that they were competing with proposals featuring significant commercial space, so their proposal was made up of high-density luxury flats in hopes of approaching the economic return of commercial development. They also included classroom and performance space for the Guildhall School of Theatre and Music. The corporation ultimately rejected this first proposal as too congested, but Joe Chamberlain had convinced them along the way that the possible economics of a luxury housing development built with the kind of density they were talking about was worth looking into. So the corporation commissioned revisions. And this, in part, is what Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond came back with. Smaller flat blocks surrounding open plazas with larger tower blocks on the periphery of the development. Also present in this proposal is the same three-dimensional use of space that they employed at Golden Lane, with sunken courtyards reserved for residents and the public confined to higher-level walkways. New in this proposal, which you'll see on the left of the screen there, is a glass pyramid conservatory, along with space for both of the city's secondary schools so they could share arts facilities with the Guildhall School. Now, it was in mid-1956 that the tide began to change in favor of the housing faction. Lord Duncan Sandys was appointed by Winston Churchill as the UK Minister of Housing and Local Government. And one of the very first things he did was to throw his weight behind the Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond plan, saying, "There are advantages in creating in the city a genuine residential neighborhood, incorporating schools, shops, open spaces, and other amenities, even if this means foregoing a more remunerative return on the land." Now, this was a clear change in government policy from Abercrombie's policy of decentralization. In response, the City Corporation formed a special Barbican committee to guide development of the Barbican area in November 1957. At this point, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond still weren't the officially commissioned architects for the project. They were being paid for their time, but the City Corporation was still reserving the right to change its mind and take the project away from them if it didn't like what they did. Nevertheless, over the course of 1958, they submitted several interim proposals, gradually increasing the density of the site. And in 1959, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond put all those revisions together and presented their full revised plan to the Barbican Committee in an elegant hardbound book. A book that the City Corporation, by the way, had not requested and did not particularly want to pay for. But they did like the plan that it contained. The plan as presented in 1959 is almost exactly what was built here. A model of the 1959 plan was actually discovered in a storage closet in the Barbican offices, the Barbican Estate offices a few years ago, and you can go see it by the Barbican gift shop if you want. It's on display. In December 1959, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond were finally commissioned as the architects for the project. Their plan approved, and this model was likely one of the final steps taken before that final approval. The corporation hired Sir Ove Arup, who had just founded his now world-famous engineering firm, to engineer the project. Arup would go on to engineer the unbuildable Sydney Opera House, among many other famous projects. They began site preparation 2 years later, in 1961, once the initial engineering work was done. The first problem they had to solve was the Circle Line tracks that ran right along the northern edge of the property. They considered just building on top of them, but noise and vibration from rail lines would be unpleasant for residents and devastating for music and theater. So they did a couple things. First, they straightened the track between Moorgate and Barbican stations. The curve was an artifact of previous development on the site, not something they had to keep, and straightening it would move the tracks away from just adjacent to the concert hall to well away from it. Second, they devised a complicated isolation system to allow the train tracks to sit on a concrete bridge that floated on rubber dampers. In this diagram, you can see the rubber dampers here, the concrete bridge above them, and then the trains would run here, with the rubber dampers keeping the vibration from propagating through the surrounding ground. The Circle Line actually runs under the lakeside terraces outside, with the tracks at about the same level I'm standing at right now, maybe a little above. This process of moving and isolating the rail lines, along with remediating the poor ground conditions elsewhere on the site, took 2 years. So while site prep started in 1961, construction on the actual estate didn't begin until 1963. The site delay gave the city corporation time to find something else about the plans to be upset about. In order to achieve the necessary density, the kitchens and bathrooms in the flats were tucked away in interior spaces. Now, this was unusual because kitchens and bathrooms in that day needed windows for ventilation. That was the common way they were built. But the architects had specified mechanical ventilation instead, newer technology at the time. City Corporation was fine with this experiment for bathrooms, but kitchens had to have windows to avoid cooking smells being a nuisance to one's neighbors. Chamberlain estimated that moving the kitchens to an exterior wall would delay construction by a year, cost £500,000, and result in a 15% loss of density and therefore revenue of the overall project. That just wouldn't do. So in December 1961, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond invited the Barbican Committee to lunch at their offices. When the committee arrived, they found that the firm had built a full-sized kitchen mock-up there in their offices for the committee to explore. After much discussion, the kitchen problem was resolved by simply lowering the partition between the kitchen and the living room, which had ample outside windows for ventilation, to integrate the two spaces. Then the last major change to Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond's plan was to the performance spaces. The 1954 plan had specified a small facility designed for the Guildhall School. The 1959 plan had, at the City Corporation's insistence, slightly enlarged the venues to make them more useful for groups beyond the Guildhall student ensembles, with a theater to seat 700 people and a concert hall to seat 1,000. In the mid-1960s, after construction on the surrounding estate was well underway, the City Corporation's Music Committee decided to set their aspirations higher, seeking facilities that would be useful for professional companies. So they asked the architects to take another pass at the plans, originally asking for the capacities of 800 for the theater and 1,300 for concerts. But then in 1966, Kenneth Cork, the chair of the Music Committee, met famed British opera director Anthony Besh. Cork tried to recruit Besh to be the director of the Arts Center, and Besh agreed to at least consult on the project. Over the next year, he and Joe Chamberlain went on a tour of successful symphony and theater venues around Europe and the United States, like the Berliner Philharmonie in Berlin and the Lincoln Center in New York. Besh came away with the conclusion that the key to making the venue sustainable was to find professional companies to take up residency. But that meant the venues needed to be larger still. By the next year, Anthony Besh had gotten the London Symphony Orchestra to commit to residency, but only if the concert hall capacity were increased to 2,000. And the Royal Shakespeare Company as well, if the theater was expanded to 1,200. Now, this new plan would make the Barbican Center the largest performing arts center in Europe, but adding that much space to an already existing design was a huge challenge. So here's what they did. First, they dug deeper. Barbican Hall and theater stall, the Barbican Hall stalls entrances and the theater stalls entrances are on level -1. So that's the doors at the back of this level. So the stage I'm standing on is something like level -2. And there's a cinema and a 200-person theater that are deeper still. Ground level in this room is actually at the entrances to the first balcony, high up there. So you can tell how far under ground level we are, those of us that are at the front of this room. They took the space that had previously housed both the theater and the concert hall and used that space to create the expanded theater. And the concert hall we're in right now is actually a whole new subterranean space, a space large enough to seat nearly 2,000 people that didn't exist at all in the original design. That was an enormous challenge because, as you can see in this cutaway, Barbican Hall is neatly nestled within the inner perimeter of Frobisher Crescent above. In fact, if you go up to the courtyard of Frobisher Crescent, you'll be standing on the roof of this hall right up there. Because the construction on the estate was already well underway when this decision was made, any new excavation would have to avoid disturbing the foundations of those buildings. Arup came up with a complex system of retaining walls that had to be built downward as they excavated the site for the hall to protect the surrounding buildings. The first residents moved into the Barbican early the next year, in 1969. The City of London produced this promotional film for the Barbican to attract residents. And for this place where supposedly nobody wanted to live, the waiting list for a flat was quickly over 1,000 people long. People loved the idea of living in the Barbican. Queen Elizabeth opened the Barbican Centre on March 3rd, 1982, ahead of the premiere of the Royal Shakespeare Company's production of Henry IV. The City of London considered the Barbican Centre its gift to the nation. And with the surrounding estate long since completed, this marked the end of over 20 years of construction at the Barbican. When all was said and done, the 35 acres of the Barbican estate contained 3 42-story tower blocks, at the time the tallest residential buildings in Europe, along with 13 terrace blocks containing a total of 2,113 flats and maisonettes. There are also 2 schools, the Guildhall School of Music and Drama and the City of London School for Girls, the Barbican Public Library, the Museum of London, a YMCA, which was converted into more flats in 2015, and the largest fine arts complex in Europe, with 1 concert hall, 2 theaters, and 3 cinemas, all designed by Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond as a single piece of architecture. The architects were intimately involved in the construction of the whole complex. They designed 4 complete sets of plans for the Barbican, but it's said the only set of plans that's actually correct is the buildings as they currently stand. The architects were making near constant adjustments as their imagined spaces came to life. It made the complex a nightmare to build, but it meant that their vision was fully realized. Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond also filled their design with subtle tributes to what had previously stood on this land. Anybody recognize this style of window? If you've seen a castle, you know this is an arrow loop designed to give an archer a safe way to fire an arrow from inside a fortification. And if you need to plan your medieval assault on the City of London, there's a pedestrian ramp lined with these at the base of Lauderdale Tower. And what castle would be complete without a moat? Now, there's a lot of water at the Barbican that's just intended to be decorative ponds and nothing more. But this narrow leg of water by the original medieval wall, yeah, that's a moat. And there's another subtle detail hiding in the background of this picture. See it? There's a battlement here along the top of this block of flats. And once you start looking for them, you'll quickly realize that battlements are everywhere at the Barbican. It's a repeating motif of the architects, an homage to what this site used to be. There's another fun bit of participatory architecture here in the Arts Center. Have you ever noticed how the stairs down to stalls level feel maybe a bit larger than they need to be? The brass handrails just a touch ostentatious, the lighting just a little bit moody? Well, that's all for you. Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond thought the audience deserved to make their own grand entrance, just like the performers they were there to watch. So they designed the Arts Center with moments like this to evoke a sense of drama for the audience as they were entering the facility. Now, unfortunately, some of these have been taken away by subsequent remodeling, and we lose one of their prime dramatic spaces, and with the stalls foyer being the exhibit hall for the conference. But if you pay attention, moments like this are scattered throughout this building. But it wasn't all fun and games. The architects came up with innovative solutions for several problems as well. The Barbican was built in the age of the automobile, and they had a mandate from the City of London Corporation to solve for cars, to provide for cars. In order to preserve their uninterrupted urban oasis, vehicle traffic at the Barbican moves in tunnels under the complex, and parking is in underground car parks woven around the Art Center's subterranean construction. This allowed for large courts, green spaces, and ponds between the buildings of the estate with not a car in sight. Unfortunately, it also led to the Barbican's legendary maze-like construction, as this design from the Art Center's opening in 1982 attests to. Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond's original design called for their high walks to be adopted by the entire City of London so that you could traverse the entire city without having to go down to street level. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. Another problem was the fly tower that the Royal Shakespeare Company required for flying backdrops and set pieces in and out of the theater. Because it would have no windows, the architects were worried that the fly tower would be an eyesore, a narrow monolith with no visual interest. So they revived their earlier idea for a conservatory very late in the design process. It's a lovely space on the top floors of the Art Center, but it's also a clever solution for the problem of an ugly fly tower. And here's what it looks like inside, a glass roof surrounding the heavily planted tower for the theater below. Finally, the original plans called for brightly colored steel-clad exteriors, much like what they had done at Golden Lane. But post-war steel rationing in the UK lasted until 1954. They were able to secure enough steel to build Golden Lane, but there was no way that would work at the scale of the Barbican estate. So they pivoted to a design that called for white marble tile exteriors. That plan would have been beautiful, but hilariously expensive, and so it was quickly vetoed by city authorities. So they adopted the mid-century building material of choice, concrete. But this was luxury housing after all, so they couldn't just do smooth concrete. Here's a few of the finishes that they experimented with, and you can see the rough white marble tiles on the bottom left. But there's actually a whole corridor of these experiments. To steal my tour guide's joke, this whole hallway is basically a mood board of concrete. And it extends down to the floor below as well. If Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond were stuck with concrete, they were going to be stuck with exactly the concrete they wanted. And the finish they decided on was pick-hammered concrete. Every bit of textured concrete that you see in the Arts Center and the surrounding estate, there's a lot of it, right? Every bit of it was hammered by hand by a worker using a pneumatic pick. It was incredibly labor-intensive. And the rock exposed by the pick hammering isn't normal concrete gravel aggregate either. All of the concrete in the Barbican was made with black basalt aggregate to prevent the iron pyrites and standard gravel from creating the rust stains that you see on so many Brutalist buildings. Raise the cost, but the building still looks good this many years later. While public opinion has gone back and forth over the years on the success of Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond's design, it's currently in vogue, thank goodness, it's hard to argue that it's not a monumental architectural achievement. A set of buildings with such a distinct sense of place, it's hard to miss that you're in the Barbican no matter where in the estate you are. If you want to live here, a small studio flat will set you back about £500,000, with larger ones stretching into multiple millions. And like Golden Lane, the entire estate and art center are again grade 2 listed. Not a bad second act for these three gentlemen. So how'd they do it? How did three young guys without a ton of experience manage to create not one, but two monumental architectural achievements back to back, while building a major architectural practice and producing graded buildings all over the United Kingdom? Go look at the University of Leeds if you want to see more of their work. We can find some clues in Tim Harford's book, Messy. The core argument Harford makes in his book is that we too often fight to bring order to messy situations, when we'd do better to embrace some degree of mess instead. Harford opens the book by talking about this album, The Colne Concert by Keith Jarrett. It's one of my very favorite stories. The famous jazz pianist was booked in 1975 to play a solo show in Colne Opera House by 17-year-old aspiring concert promoter Vera Brandes. Jarrett had specified the piano that he wanted for the show, a specific model Bosendorfer Concert Grand. Wires got crossed, though, and while the piano Jarrett found on stage that afternoon was indeed a Bosendorfer, it wasn't the right Bosendorfer. It was a practice piano, a baby grand, that was badly out of tune and far too weak for the 1,400-person concert hall. It was too late to get the correct piano brought to the hall, and it was raining outside. And after a tuner spent all afternoon working on the baby grand, it still wasn't good enough. Jarrett initially refused to play. He was going to walk. But Brandes begged him to go on, and he finally relented. The album recorded of that performance has gone on to be the best-selling solo jazz album of all time and the best-selling piano album of all time. On the recording, you can hear Jarrett grunting and vocalizing as he wrestles everything he can out of that deficient piano. The style he created that night in response to the constraints of the instrument went on to be his signature style. Embracing the constraints made Keith Jarrett's career. It's tempting to think that Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond succeeded in building grand things in spite of post-war austerity, but that's not how they saw it. Powell put it best himself. We come from the poverty-struck years of post-war reconstruction. It's not that we were simply screwed down by cost controls. They became natural to us, aided by the fashion for the spare and the simple. The constraints and chaos they faced were not a hindrance to Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond. They were what fueled their creativity. The chaos of post-war Reconstruction London directly led to the architecture contest that they won, giving them the opportunity to build Golden Lane Estate. Instead of being deterred by the big-name architects whose proposals were being covered in the press, they leaned into the chaos of the competition, and they made a name for themselves. Then they created a proposal for the Barbican site at the request of a few individuals, a full set of plans, not a small amount of work, without any idea of if they would ever be paid for it or not. There were any number of times that they could have walked away from the project, given the chaos of working with the city corporation, first as they decided what to do with the Barbican site, refusing to give them the charter, and then as they requested major revision after major revision, even as the project was in progress. Their creativity could have been stifled by the constraint of having to build the project out of concrete, the same thing everyone else was using, but they pushed through. They made the material their own. Now, I don't know about you all, but this last half decade is the most chaotic period I can remember in my entire career. In the last 5 years, we've dealt with the COVID pandemic causing office closures, and then layoffs, and then a massive hiring wave, and then a return to office mandate. And if that weren't enough, rapid inflation ended more than a decade of 0% interest rates, causing a capital crunch and the wave of layoffs that we're still living through right now. And depending on who you talk to, generative AI is either worthless or programming as a profession is dead, and there's not much in between. Those are the two viewpoints you're allowed to have. The landscape in front of us is chaotic. But think about the world that Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond faced. University professors toiling away in the classroom, longing to make their mark on the world of architecture in the middle of a world of austerity and constraint. We face the same choice they did. We can put our heads down, try to keep putting one foot in front of the other, and wait for the chaos to subside. Or we can lean into the mess. And that's the encouragement I'm here to give you today, friends. In the words of Tim Harford, real creativity, excitement, and humanity lie in the messy parts of life, not the tidy ones. His book is filled with story after story along these lines, and the Barbican could have been one of them. That's the lesson of the Barbican, of Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond. The tech industry is a messy place right now. But like Lena said this morning, the tech industry isn't just happening to us. Everyone in this room is the tech industry. So rather than letting the tech industry happen to you, do what these three gentlemen did. Engage with the chaos and the constraints around you. Push the world in the direction that you want it to go. Leading right now is absolutely critical work. And it might just end up being career defining. You never know. Thanks.